Imagine this. Almost every decision you make is shaped by something you don't speak aloud, rarely think about, but carry with you like an invisible companion whispering in your ear. Why do you freeze in terror at the mere thought of losing your job, ending a relationship, or even just genuinely expressing your true feelings? Why does the idea of starting fresh make your heart clench, your breath catch, and your stomach tie itself in painful knots? Perhaps beneath all these minor fears lies one truly colossal fear, yet so obvious we fail to notice it. Death. But not the death that comes with the end of the body. We're talking about psychological death, the demise of identity, the destruction of the ego, the loss of familiar certainty and comfort. These are the tiny yet agonizing deaths of old habits, of who you were or who you felt you were supposed to be. Carl Jung, one of the titans of depth psychology, asserted that the fear of death is not merely the dread of ceasing to exist. It runs far deeper. It's the fear of living life unconsciously, of fleeing from one's own shadow, of being forever trapped in the chains of the familiar and paralyzed in the face of the unknown. What happens when this all-encompassing fear, like an invisible puppeteer, completely takes control of your life? Think back for a moment to your childhood. Most of us didn't just learn about death. We were prepared for it, indoctrinated, our attitudes shaped long before we understood its meaning. By age 5, you had likely already heard those anxious words. "Don't do that. You'll hurt yourself." Or "Be careful, that's dangerous," said perhaps with a slight panic in the voice, with a quick hand movement trying to stop you. And every scraped knee, every whisper of tragedy from adults in the next room, every fairy tale where the villain inevitably met a terrible end, all of it settled deep into the child's mind, forming a vague yet powerful fear. Death wasn't explained. It was shrouded in mystery, avoided, mourned in silence, and most importantly, feared. From this primal, deeply ingrained fear, we unconsciously constructed an entire defense system. To avoid pain at all costs, to shy away from endings, to cling to the familiar, dreading any change. In psychology, this phenomenon is called death anxiety, a fundamental unease that permeates our very existence. Ernest Becker, in his monumental work, The Denial of Death, argued that a lion's share of human behavior, our insatiable drive for fame, the desire to leave a legacy, our clinging to routine, and even at times a show of moral superiority, is nothing more than a desperate attempt to symbolically cheat death. These are our ways of feeling significant, of gaining an illusion of control over what is, in reality, uncontrollable. Carl Jung delved even deeper, suggesting that this pervasive fear of death is reflected in our shadow side, those unappealing or uncomfortable parts of our personality that we so diligently deny, suppress, and prefer to ignore, trying to hide them from ourselves and the world. For Carl Jung, death was not an ending but a great transformation, an inevitable life-giving cycle on the path to individuation, to achieving wholeness. But instead of embracing this fundamental law, most of us desperately resist because from childhood we were taught that death is synonymous with loss. The loss of control over our lives, the loss of our own identity, the loss of the self. And in this resistance, we are, in essence, rebelling against our own evolution. But here's a striking fact. Not every culture perceives death as a terrifying tragedy. In Colombia, Dia de Muertos is a riot of colors, a vibrant, joyful celebration of those who have passed. In some parts of the Middle East and Oceania, death is seen as a natural transition, not a crushing catastrophe. Ancestors are revered, their memory carefully preserved, not erased. Souls are welcomed with open hearts, not trembled before in fear. So what have they understood that we, modern people, have irrevocably forgotten? that the fear of death will not slow its arrival by a single iota. It only forces us to narrow our own horizons, to thin out life by trying to avoid the inevitable, to avoid risks, to avoid deep love, to avoid bold career changes, to avoid looking into the deepest corners of our souls. And by bitter irony, this is precisely the slowest, most agonizing death of all possible deaths. Now let's zoom in and look at the concept of change. Every significant transformation in your life, every painful breakup, every move, every job change, every crisis, every breakthrough, felt like a kind of death, didn't it? That's because it was. The death of an old identity, a defunct pattern, a completed stage. Carl Jung, the insightful explorer of the soul, gave these crisis moments a striking name: psychic deaths. He saw them as nothing less than necessary, sometimes agonizing, collapses of the false self. This is not destruction, but clearing. A vital process designed to free up inner space for something deeply authentic and true. But how do we as humans react to these little deaths? We are terrified of their approach, instinctively clinging to the familiar, to what is known and safe, even if it has long ceased to serve our well-being. We freeze in place, allowing relationships to slowly dim our inner light, dull our senses. We sink into the stupor of routine, convincing ourselves that this is synonymous with security. We silence entire facets of our personality just to avoid disrupting the fragile, illusory world around us. Why? Because any alternative, any uncertainty, any encounter with the unknown seems unbearably frightening. But what's truly astonishing is not only the emotional, but also the deeply physiological nature of this fear. Our amygdala, the ancient fear center in the brain, reacts to the threat of ego death almost as violently as it does to direct physical danger. Our nervous system doesn't differentiate. For it, profound change is tantamount to dying, a threat to our very existence. So what to do? How do we break free from the grip of this subconscious primal fear of death that subtly controls our decisions, constrains our growth, and relentlessly narrows the horizons of our lives? If this fear isn't just a fear of dying, but something much deeper, the terror of losing the version of ourselves we've so carefully constructed and grown accustomed to, then how do we deal with it? And here the wisdom of Carl Jung comes to our aid, his piercing observation. What you resist not only persists, but will grow in size. These are not just words. This is a profound warning. If we stubbornly deny our fear of endings, of inevitable changes, of the painful but necessary collapse of the ego, we don't push them away. On the contrary, we quietly but relentlessly feed them, giving them power over us. Most of us, without realizing it, do exactly that. We relentlessly chase something, cling to the familiar, strive for excessive achievements, so feverishly that we never pause long enough to ask ourselves the most important question: why am I really doing this? Let's pull back the curtain on this deeply ingrained habit. Carl Jung gave the world a concept that forever changed our understanding of the human psyche: the shadow. The shadow is everything you reject in yourself, everything you stubbornly refuse to acknowledge. Every dark impulse, every piercing fear, every burning desire that you lock away in the farthest, darkest closets of your mind. And guess what lurks deep within? The primal fear of death, and all those countless little deaths you dread. Being insignificant, unloved, losing control, starting over, or most terrifying of all, being truly seen without pretense. Our culture demands that we be productive, positive, and flawless, but never exposed, vulnerable, or insecure. So we suppress these true feelings and falsely call it strength. We immerse ourselves in incessant hustle, and that becomes our purpose. We remain silent, and that is our peace. Thus, unconsciously, we crave certainty. We choose jobs that promise illusory stability instead of those that ignite a spark within us. We prefer relationships that are familiar and safe instead of those that challenge and help us grow. We cling to our roles, being nice, smart, the indispensable helper, because letting them go feels tantamount to death. True, authentic life requires us to die again and again, not in a physical sense, but metaphorically, to let go of who we were in order to finally become who we truly are. And this is incredibly frightening, because it is the shadow that holds this truth. If you dare to step into it, you will never be the same. But alas, if you don't take that step, you will never truly live. Now let's talk about our beloved comfort zones. You know the phrase, better the devil you know. That's not wisdom. That's the primal animal fear of death whispering in your ear. That's your brain, your ego, desperately clinging to the familiar, trying to avoid the frightening unknown at all costs. And can you blame it? Because the unknown is where we imagine everything ends. And the known is stagnation, where everything remains unchanged. The same friends, the same beliefs, the same identity, even if it's long since empty, even if you feel trapped. Because at least it's familiar. And familiar, we think, is safe. But is it really? The bitter truth is that we desperately confuse comfort with safety, but they are two entirely different things. Comfort gently whispers on stay here. It's so warm and cozy, don't take risks, don't rock the boat. But true growth, the growth of soul and spirit, loudly proclaims, this version of you is outdated. It's time to let it go. It's time to become more. Herein lies the trap of modern life. Our society doesn't just tolerate this flight from oneself, it actively fuels and encourages it. Feeling a midlife crisis approaching? Buy a new, shiny car. Feeling lost and empty? Quickly post a perfect selfie. Afraid of impending change? Get a trendy daily planner and meticulously optimize every hour. All of this is merely a desperate attempt to control what is inherently uncontrollable, to numb, to silence what truly requires deep experience and reflection. For to face your deep-seated fear of death, the fear of any ending, is to honestly admit, I am not in control of this, and it is in this admission that true liberating freedom lies. Let's imagine our psyche divided into two fundamental entities. The first is our surviving self. This is the restless part of us that instinctively flees from any discomfort, eagerly seeks external approval, and is panically afraid of any endings. It's an inner voice, almost a whisper that insistently tells us, stay small so you'll be loved. Stay safe, don't take risks. The second, however, is the becoming self. This is the courageous version of you that relentlessly seeks truth, even if the path to it leads through pain and disappointment. This is the part capable of gracefully accepting the unknown and coming to terms with the fact that not everything is understandable. This is no longer a whisper, but rather a deep inner calling that wisely reminds us, yes, change is scary, but the true horror is stagnation. And these two entities, these two selves, are in a continuous, relentless struggle. At the core of the surviving self lies our ego, that very part which, by bitter irony, is fanatically obsessed with avoiding death and any endings. However, the becoming self wisely recognizes, for true growth, for genuine evolution, sometimes it's necessary to simply let go, to surrender to the flow of life. Here it is, the eternal paradox that pierces the very essence of our being. The more desperately we cling to life, driven by a deep fear of losing it, the duller the spark of true life flickers within us. And conversely, only by accepting our finite, inevitable mortality do we achieve genuine, boundless freedom. This is what the great Carl Jung called the process of individuation, a sacred path to wholeness. A path where we don't just reconcile but actively integrate all the rejected hidden parts of our soul, our shadow, our fears, and even the most inevitable all-consuming death. For Jung, one who dared to embrace death does not become dark or despairing. On the contrary, they become truly awakened. Such a person ceases to exist by default, no longer seeks external validation, and discards maps drawn by others' anxieties and prejudices. For they have dared to look their inner dragon in the eye, and with piercing clarity realize that all this time, the dragon was nothing other than themselves. Therefore, I want to invite you to ponder a profound question. Are you living simply to survive the flow of days, or to become who you are meant to be? At some point, a subtle but fundamental shift occurs. You finally stop running in panic from the shadow of death and begin to sit calmly beside it face to face. At first, it happens almost inaudibly, like a whisper. You start to notice the subtlest pauses, the weightless empty spaces, and suddenly realize that silence itself is no longer threatening. You no longer feel the need to frantically fill every inner void with deafening noise, endless plans, or compulsive stimulation. Because now you clearly understand the deep-seated fear at the very core was never a fear of death itself. It was always a fear of disconnection. Disconnection from yourself, from the present moment being lived, from that natural, eternal rhythm of impermanence that does not destroy but harmoniously binds all things together. This realization doesn't come like a sudden flash of lightning. It permeates like a gentle, persistent whisper, slowly but deeply rewriting your relationship with life itself. Here is a truth whose depth reveals itself more fully with each moment of reflection. Our suffering is not born from things ending. We suffer because we desperately try to hold on to them forever. We treat life as if it needs to be kept under a glass dome, shielded from any touch of change. We dream of a job frozen in time, unchanging forever, of relationships immune to any transformations, of a version of ourselves that remains untouched, unaffected, universally loved, and never changing. But nothing authentic can stand still. Your body, your values, your worldview, all are in constant living motion. Clinging tightly to anything means condemning yourself to suffering. And yet this is what we've been conditioned to do. We seek unshakable stability in a world that is inherently impermanent. We call this success, reliability, and achievement, but in reality it's just a desperate attempt to protect the ego from dissolution, from the inevitable flow of change. Carl Jung warned against this spiritual stagnation. He called it identification with the persona, a fatal error when we mistake our masks for our true self. It's a role, an image, a version of ourselves that performs wonderfully in the external world, but quietly, imperceptibly stifles our inner growth. What lies beneath the surface when we finally loosen our iron grip? Suddenly we feel an unprecedented calm, boundless openness, something far deeper than ordinary identity. This is not emptiness, not an absence, but rather an all-encompassing presence. It's not the death of the familiar self, but rather the birth of a spaciousness where your true essence begins to shine. But let's be honest, this is by no means easy. We exist in a society where youth is cult-worshipped, and aging is perceived as a repulsive disease to be avoided at all costs. Grief? We neatly tuck it into the politest, most inconspicuous corners. We hide old age, secretly put down beloved pets, and for the very act of dying, we invent countless euphemisms just to avoid calling things by their names. Even our language becomes an accomplice to this deception. We say people have passed, as if they merely stepped out of the room for a moment, forgetting their keys. We desperately avoid even the thought of death, for it is a cruel reminder that we are not in control of what happens. And this helplessness is unbearable, especially in a world where control is the highest, most coveted currency. Control your body, manage your brand, shape your future. They echo everywhere. But death has no business with your meticulously planned marketing strategy, your smoothie diet, or your ambitious business projects. It simply arrives when it arrives, without a knock, without warning, asking no one for permission. By hiding death, we don't just turn away from the end. We deprive ourselves of all its profound lessons. We lose the art of surrender, the ability to live from authentic depth rather than superficial drama. We forget how to let go gracefully, consciously, without guilt or punishment. This is how we raise generations who desperately cling to the illusion of control, mistaking it for safety and chase endless busyness, erroneously seeing it as the meaning of life. But what if we dared to remember its true meaning? Death is not a sentence, not a defeat, not an inglorious collapse. It is a sacred completion, a point of return, a gate leading back to the source of all being. In many ancient indigenous traditions, death is not just tolerated, it is welcomed as a wise teacher. In Oceanian cosmologies, ancestors don't vanish without a trace but walk invisibly alongside the living. In Colombian culture, the departed are celebrated with fanfare, invited back with offerings and songs. And in Hinduism, death is an integral, harmonious part of the majestic cosmic dance. Birth, life, dissolution, and rebirth. There is profound wisdom in cultures that do not seek to sanitize death, do not hide it behind sterile screens. They don't just mourn the departed, they honor the great transformation. They have grasped what we seem to have lost. The end is not an enemy to be feared. It is a powerful portal. To realize this, you don't need to go to a monastery or take vows. It's enough to simply slow down enough to feel. Allow yourself to mourn not only departed loved ones, but also those parts of yourself, those former versions that no longer serve your true path. Let parts of yourself die without rushing to fill that void with frantic productivity or hasty reinterpretation. Leave space for the deep silence that follows an ending, for it is in this fertile darkness that something entirely new ripens. Carl Jung once remarked that the greatest tragedies of life are not what happens to us, but the lives we never truly lived, constrained by fear. And perhaps this is the true meaning of awakening. It's not about avoiding death, but about allowing its wisdom to soften and shape us. So perhaps death is not just an inevitable fact of existence. Perhaps it is that missing ingredient, the humbling force that keeps us in reality. The force that brings us back to what truly matters. The one that burns away illusions until nothing remains but pure truth. You have dared to enter a conversation that most people avoid their entire lives. Few are willing to genuinely ask, does the shadow of death truly define how I live? And if you're still here, still reflecting, it means something deep within you is ready. Ready not just to understand death, but to stop allowing the fear of it to dictate your story. Now let's look at what awaits us after. Not after the last breath, no, but after the fear lets go. What is it like to live when the shadow of death no longer looms over every choice we make? Most of us, as if by unspoken agreement, have grown accustomed to treating our identity as a priceless trophy. We build it brick by brick and then fiercely guard it, protecting it with incredible effort. We create armor for ourselves out of declarations. I am this kind of person, I never do that, I always need this. But then, as often happens, reality bursts into our lives. Inexorable changes come, grief knocks at the door. An entirely new chapter opens, and suddenly that very identity we so desperately and diligently maintained begins to crack deeply, like an old fresco. It is at this moment that many are seized with panic. Their world seemingly collapses, their heart clenches, their breath catches. But you don't need to succumb to this terror. For as soon as you release the fear of death, you will automatically stop clinging to your rigidly fixed identity. You will gain the ability to adapt, not becoming spineless or inconstant. No, you will become fluid, like a river bypassing obstacles. You will realize the profound truth. Your essence is not a frozen product, but an ever-moving, evolving process. Carl Jung himself, the great thinker, called this one of the main signs of true maturity. Not striving to be someone unchanging, but simply being authentic. And this incredible flexibility becomes your true superpower. You no longer feel devastated when old beliefs quietly fade into oblivion. You are not crushed by the winds of change. You simply change. And this is not a sign of weakness, no. It is the deepest wisdom. So how do we truly live with death when it's not somewhere out there but here, beside us? Not in terror, not in stupor, but with full awareness. This doesn't mean you need to constantly imagine your funeral or hastily draw up a will, though these thoughts can sometimes be useful. It means structuring your life so that death doesn't abruptly cut it short, like a thread, but becomes a natural, dignified completion. Stop for a moment and ask yourself a piercing and honest question. If today were your last, full of awareness and presence, how would you spend every moment of it? Would you continue to mindlessly scroll through others' lives as if in a daze, as if nothing truly matters? Would you still postpone the words that yearn to be spoken, the feelings that so desperately need expression? Or would you still push away joy, convincing yourself that you first need to finish all your tasks? But living, knowing that death is invisibly present in your room, does not mean immersing yourself in constant drama or gloomy contemplation. On the contrary, it is a path to deep, meaningful thoughtfulness. You feel less susceptible to momentary reactions. You are harder to offend by trifles. You become wonderfully grounded, rooted in the present. You no longer need every moment to unfold strictly according to your script. Your only true desire is for it to be authentic, alive, real. You stop squandering your precious energy on things that only deplete and exhaust you, draining your vital forces. You begin to guard your inner peace like a priceless treasure, like something sacred, because that's exactly what it is. So, all right, but how do we put these thoughts into practice? What do we do practically? Here are a few simple but powerful steps typically taken by those who have come to terms with their mortality. They learn to ask themselves completely different, much deeper questions. Instead of the usual, what do I need to fix about myself? They ask, what am I really running from? What am I avoiding facing? Instead of the superficial, how do I look to others, they turn inward. Does this feel like my truth? Does this align with who I truly am? Their time doesn't slip through their fingers, it is carefully planned. You'll never see their calendars jam-packed with empty, meaningless tasks. On the contrary, they consciously leave space for rest, for deep silence, for genuine connection. In short, for life itself. They don't put off living, getting their affairs in order while they still breathe. They find the strength to apologize. They are the first to extend a hand of reconciliation, forgiving grievances. They clarify misunderstandings so that loved ones are not left in sorrowful confusion. They accept the entire spectrum of existence with deep respect. For not every day illuminates us with inspiration. Some pass in silence, others in grief, still others in mundane routine, and all of it is an integral part of the fullness of life. And this is where the deepest, most radical transformation occurs. When death doesn't frighten but is accepted as an inevitable part of the journey, you stop desperately seeking courage in the external world. You no longer wait for approval. You no longer wait for someone else to take the first step. You stop postponing what you deeply know. This is your calling, your path. Because now you understand that true fear is not about failing or being misunderstood. The real horror is looking back and realizing you never truly tried. Death grants us a sense of urgency, but it's not the frantic haste that drives us in an endless race. It's an urgency that comes from the soul itself, one that quietly but persistently whispers, "You don't have eternity, but you have right now." And this right now is more than enough to begin. It wasn't about death. In reality, this message was about the very essence of life, that elusive aliveness that we sometimes hold tight, sometimes fear to our core, sometimes desperately avoid, until we finally find the strength to reclaim it. As Carl Jung wisely noted, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And here is the undeniable truth. You can never achieve that privilege if you spend your entire life running from endings, from inevitable finales. So let this be your most important reminder. Your time is not just precious. It is invaluable precisely because it is limited. And this finitude does not make it sad. On the contrary, it imbues it with the deepest meaning, making it sacred.